There are few games that can boast the title of being one of the founding titles of a given region. When people think Western MMORPGs, for example, they think Ultima Online, World of Warcraft, EverQuest, and many more. What about the equivalent in the eastern half of the world? MapleStory, Lineage, and easily the topic of this episode, Ragnarok Online. These iconic titles help set the tone and standard of what was expected in those given slices of the world. Ragnarok Online launched back in 2002 in Korea, and would make its way to the West in the summer of 2003. RO would not only be a great success in Korea, it would also share high levels of success in Japan and other areas of Asia, Latin America, and the general Western market. But although RO had its share of success upon its journey to being a pioneer MMORPG of Korea and the world, the company behind the game, Gravity, would have many controversies that would both hurt the company and change the story of RO. On this episode of Death of a Game, we take a look at the iconic Ragnarok Online, the sandbox from the East, and not just the normal diagnosing of what the game's biggest contributing factors to its death are, but also account for the great success that was RO, and how it achieved such. Let's get to the video, detectives. We have quite the mystery to solve. But before we get to it, Tom and I have some bills to pay. We're currently working on commissioning a new intro and graphic scheme for the channel, in modern Western mystery art style. In order to get that and afford our cost of living as is, we need your support especially. Join our Patreon or YouTube memberships to support us monetarily, as we do not chase trends nor view counts. As such, we rely on sponsorships and loyal viewers to watch the videos through, and if you can, to support in any way monetarily. Thank you again to all the detectives who support the channel on Patreon and YouTube memberships already, and to those who support the channel in any other way, including watching this video. All support is absolutely wanted and respected. Let's get to the mystery. The story of Ragnarok begins offline, with its creator, Lee Myung-jin. Back in 1995, Lee would create Ragnarok originally as a manhwa, or what most people refer to as Korean anime. But please note that Ragnarok wasn't Japanese anime or manga, or even really Japanese. It was from Korea, but it was Nordic themed. Lee would create as many as 40 books in the series before teaming up with a notable Korean developer, Kim Hak-yu, and working on Ragnarok Online under the company Gravity. Gravity was founded back in 2000, with the goal of launching Ragnarok Online. This approach was quite common for some of the more popular MMOs that had launched in the very beginning of things. When they launched, they already had these pre-existing audiences, like Ultima Online for example, and worlds full of lore. Ragnarok Online would do the same thing, and as the name implied, was Norse mythology themed, but done in an anime style. So needless to say, it was both unique and already positioned greatly for a proper launch. The largest wrinkle in the story of RO would come before the game would ever even launch in Korea, let alone the US. RO was in its closed beta, sometime between 2001 and 2002. RO was doing fantastically. It was capturing and captivating an audience at an impressive rate. That's when it happens though. The biggest bit of drama in RO, regarding the monetization plan. Originally, as in beta for example, RO was a free-to-play game. Right before launch, it was announced that Gravity would be shifting the game to a paid subscription model, which was typical for the time. The response from fans was explosive. They made it known immediately that this was against their desires. In the early 2000s, the stomach for a subscription model was still young, especially globally and in the Asian markets. It wasn't just a matter of bait and switch that fans had to deal with, there was even more that came from the switch. Fans would actually hack the Gravity offices and get access to precious account information that wasn't encoded, including the source code of the beta itself. Yep, hackers are the reason that the beta for RO was brought down abruptly. They got the access because essentially they hacked the game, which allowed them to then hack the Gravity offices. Gravity was pushed to near bankruptcy at this point. It was desperate, and they were in need of help. Enter Samsung Electronics, who purchases Gravity of all companies. This meant that RO in many ways was forced to start over, and throughout its lifecycle would suffer from the lack of content, including the promised content from the pre-Samsung acquisition. Samsung would then take the company public, making Gravity one of the first publicly traded video game companies. There was a list of these features that would be missing. Player housing, no loading screens on map switches, double the size of the maps, satellite cities for every town, the Merc system, which did come later, a fleshed out PvP system, which sort of came later, and additional class branches, which also sort of came later. The part that I disagree about is that the dev team was trying to paint this that, well, this wouldn't have happened had private servers not happened. Well, sorry Gravity, not encoding your pertinent information and not having a source code backup, as well as blindsiding your audience with the monetization shift, seem to be more of your issue, to be blunt, but that's just me. Samsung would hire a management company to oversee development, which has never really gone well, AVP. And not long after Kim Hak-yoo, lead developer of RO and CEO of Gravity, would leave the company, with rumors of being forced out by Samsung. In typical big company fashion, Samsung, new to MMOs and online gaming in general at this point especially, would make two crucial mistakes in this process. Not only did they lose the creative lead and CEO previously, while essentially losing the source code, they had nobody to properly replace him or the workers that left with him. This isn't me making excuses for them, let me preface with that. And if this was a modern context, I probably wouldn't be saying this, but in the early 2000s, finding experienced MMO developers, let alone online gaming developers, was pretty much finding a unicorn. So it's not surprising that Gravity would be filled with junior developers, or new ones altogether, tasked with finishing Ragnarok Online. The second mistake that Gravity made was instead of them handling the publishing for RO, they would be dividing the publishing up by country, and not even region. This meant that RO would have as many as 15 different publishers, all tasked with introducing RO to their given market. The main catch was they weren't given some blueprint or standard on how to accomplish that. Which, as you can already infer, meant that many of these servers would feature different aspects, sometimes controversial from each other. And they basically were in open competition with each other, as other companies could even compete for the rights to host the game too. While there were positives that came from this, as I will explain later on, it was primarily a huge divide presented to RO and its global audience early on. RO would launch, lost source code or not, in Korea in 2002. RO's launch in Korea was successful, but shockingly not nearly as successful as expected. There were already private servers in creation. Remember that leaked source code? Well, private servers in the case of RO would live to be 15 years old in some cases, some even older than the actual full live servers. And these private servers would prove to be the most significant way to play and enjoy RO for probably the majority of its lifecycle for a number of reasons. For starters, the private servers were free, but that wasn't the only reason, and it was kind of scapegoated as the reason. XP gain rates for Korea even were quite high, and players wanted that tweaked alongside some quality of life changes that the game needed. Let's talk about the pioneer title that Ragnarok Online is and was, in the gameplay context specifically. I use the word pioneer to not just reflect what it literally is true about RO, but that it wasn't just one of the first. It was one of the best, and still in some eyes is seen that way. Ragnarok Online, as I stated before, was a unique anime sandbox, but it actually borrowed elements from Korea's mega hit Lineage instead of other titles that people would have expected, and the Western world's Ultima Online, which was a good thing overall. It meant that, unlike many anime-themed games, RO was an actual serious title with actually serious systems. It had seriously robust, and that's a lot of serious, in-depth mechanics, even if lacking at launch from what was initially promised. In RO, you could build your character like in Ultima, however you saw fit. A tank mage, sure, why not? A hard, slow-hitting rogue? That was possible too. In RO, no matter if it was meta necessarily, players had access to custom archetypes and kind of played whatever they wanted. That's where I think RO is super unique. It's not just that they had this open skill system, that they actually managed to merge that with a class system too. In RO, you have a base level and a job level. Characters start as novices without skills or abilities. At level 10, they can pick their first job, which augments their skills and grants them abilities. You can then do this again at level 40. That's a lot of progression, and you can see the similarities with Lineage and other titles that people will probably be referencing in the comments now. The sheer amount of skill and class possibilities, though, is what always made RO feel unique, even if the combat for even the time wasn't really terribly impressive. Now, disclaimer, I didn't play RO originally. I was playing a very similar, slightly more Diablo version of the game, also copied off of Lineage, dubbed Dark Eden. Think Vampires Sans Glitter. A game that's actually older than RO, by the way. These style of games had tremendous grinds, but that's always kind of spoken from this negative perspective. As someone who managed to get through these grinds even when they were times one, the feeling of power and satisfaction that you would get when you would reach a certain power level was unique and pretty addicting. And games lacking compelling and challenging leveling experiences sort of miss this journey, if you will. So many modern MMOs you basically just skip to the end, while games like RO were about the journey. You started playing the game as soon as you created your character. There was no rush to endgame per se. And while later iterations of RO would become more solo-centric, early RO was incredibly group-centric, much like the titles it borrowed from. In fact, RO without a group, you couldn't really do any of the dungeons or high-level content effectively. That would change later on, much to the chagrin of the fanbase. It wasn't just the difficulty from the environment that made players band together and socialize, though. It was a compelling world full of iconic locations, such as Geffen, Prontera, and the cozy Alberta also contributed, and of course those are just my examples. Please list yours in the comments below. And hosting seasonal events made everything feel so homely. But the arguably biggest reason of them all was there since the game's inception. I mean, before the game's inception. Lee Myung-jin's fantastic art brought to life in RO was a crowning jewel of the game. It brought with it this legendary, timeless status to the game. The sprites in RO were 2D, but capable of navigating in a beautiful 3D environment. Now, for some people, you might just be thinking this is because of limitations or because this is the best that they could do, but this was very deliberate. This small but massive change geniusly puts more of the focus on the playable character. This enhances roleplay and the immersion of the game. It's hard for 2D games to do that, which is why RO doing this hybrid version of that was just genius. It gives the game this timeless art style, as many MMOs, including in the early 2000s, were more focused on the high-fidelity graphics, while RO had these beautiful illustrations and sprites. The high-fidelity graphics would age poorly, meanwhile RO still looks good visually. This is a significant contributor and why the game is so positively remembered still today. Couple this with the soundtrack from the legendary Korean gaming soundtrack producer Soundtip, and you had a perfect blend of a hardcore game that borrowed from hardcore games and a pretty pleasant and palatable presentation. Contrast this with many other hardcore MMOs which look hardcore, and you can see the stroke of genius that was and is Ragnarok Online. RO would launch officially in the US in the summer of 2003, to a bit of a quiet critical reception, but quite the fan reception. The Western market had never played an anime-looking sandbox MMO before. RO was perfectly positioned to take advantage of the growing popularity of both anime and Asian entertainment for the time. Ragnarok Online would launch in Europe April 15th, 2004, and come to Oceania servers in 2004 as well. The world for the first time being exposed to a unique Korean anime sandbox was one part of the equation of people not knowing what to expect. But the issue was that the grinding expected and accepted in Eastern cultures was different than the Western culture. This meant that when the rest of the world got exposed to Ragnarok Online, one of the biggest complaints at launch was the XP gain rate. The other issue for RO at launch was it was still bare bones from when they played it in beta. Throw in the fact that they switched the game to a paid model at the last second, and you can see where most players had their issues. These three things alongside the hacked source code would contribute to why Ragnarok Online early on had such an early and prominent private server scene. The community servers were, simply speaking, run better and more customized to the regions that they were in. Some private servers not only had different and faster XP gain rate, they had better server performance and even newer content. Ragnarok Online's story is very much the story of official versus private servers, from essentially the beginning of the game. But before players fall into the trap of gravity, pun intended, of assuming private servers were killing Ragnarok Online, let me tell you, I think that that's a faulty premise. Yes, private servers were taking from the official servers, but they were free servers not really trying to make a profit. They could only exist because the official servers weren't good enough. Besides the aforementioned reasons, you have to remember that the publishers were country specific. So the other issues players were having, in the worst case scenario, their given server for their region or country was running more aggressive monetization, and the slightly worse case was that your server wasn't up to date because the rights holders had to actually purchase and acquire new updates for Ragnarok Online. Speaking of new updates, early on Gravity had this idea to release content in episodes of sorts. The issue being that these were paid episodes, not analogous to expansions. This meant that on top of being a paid subscription-based game, RO was proving to be quite expensive, especially for early 2000s. That's not counting the nickel and dime that would come pretty soon after, in the way of microtransactions that would start to take hold during the early launch of RO. These servers lacking new up-to-date content from Korea and Japan and pushing more aggressive monetizations were the largest contributing factors for players going to private servers, but genuine reasons for Gravity to address nonetheless. It wasn't just on the negative end either. Speaking of Korea, they were the main server naturally, but Japan had an incredibly popular server as well, and was utilizing a more fair business model that was based on a sliding scale specific to each player's real-life earnings. This meant that unlike most of the other servers, Japan was actually lowering the barrier for entry for players to get in, which helped combat private servers and make their server do much better. So the war of private servers in RO is a long and complicated one that from the outside you can certainly get the wrong idea about. But this story will continue to evolve, and not for the best, as the case unfolds more. Gravity would try to capitalize on the success of RO in the East with an anime dubbed Ragnarok the Animation, released April 6, 2004. They released about 24 episodes, and overall the anime was positively received. You can still go watch the anime, by the way, and it's again, not half bad. Very reminiscent of Dot Hack and Sword Art Online, or even Overlord, which had very similar premises. The Rebirth update, aka the Transcendent update, would hit sometime in 2004 as well, and was a rather significant update for in-game progression. By this point, Gravity had put out 9 episodes of content, which included new towns, cities, and regions to explore. This was released the same month as the anime. RO's strong reign of multiple updates in a year, though, would slow down from this point on. After Kim Ha-kyu's departure before the launch of RO, he would find another project to work on. Another unique online RPG dubbed Granado Espada, and based on Mayan lore and history. Granado Espada was never quite viewed as the world beater of a title, but certainly another positive title to add to Kim's belt, and certainly deserving of its very own episode, but let's focus on the extensive history of RO. Kim would continue to develop more titles following Granado Espada, which goes to show how much Gravity had sort of fumbled the bag there. Having a talented developer like that assisting on RO, or making new projects for Gravity, would have definitely been helpful and needed. Meanwhile, Gravity in 2006 had released a number of new classes, such as the Gunslinger, the Ninja, the Soul Linker, but greatly slowed down on their episodic content, going from full episodes to piecemeal minor update versions, which would continue to be their MO going forward. One of the coolest things that RO did throughout its long lifespan, and I mean long, was a companion mobile app that allowed you to play as a mage in RO. I've been banging the drum for companion apps, metaphorically really, for MMOs for ages, before the mobile market even blew up. It just seems like a no-brainer for me. You can allow players to access their friends list, the game's economy, and more things as a way to bridge the gap between platforms, and also let people play when they're away from their PC. Mobile Mage was the next step of that. It was actually letting you play as a mage in a limited version of the game. But still, Mobile Mage was truly ahead of its time, and MMOs could still learn from that. But while RO was ahead in some respects, they were unfortunately behind in others. Yeah, they were lacking things that every sandbox game had just about, like player housing, but they were also lacking very rudimentary things, like a mail system that wasn't added until years after launch. This weird juxtaposition kept RO as both this innovative and new title, and kind of behind the times at the same time. A slew of shutdowns would hit various Ragnarok servers in 2007. The first 2 to shut down would be Ragnarok India, Vietnam, and then the Oceania servers by March of 2007. In some of these servers' cases, like the Middle East and Vietnam servers, RMT, or real money trading, was a serious unregulated issue that the rights holders to run the servers weren't really equipped to fix. The Oceania servers and India servers just simply had issues from poaching from other servers and general server instability. Various servers would be brought back at different points of the game, but generally speaking, when RO servers would shut down in a region, another server would open up to that given region to try to fill in the gap with limited success. RO failing in other parts of the world could be attributed to many of the reasons that we already listed, but having RMT quite rampant certainly wasn't helping any of these servers. It should be noted that RMT typically exists because there's a cash shop or microtransactions. It's typically a response from the players to try to circumvent that process. So at the same time, it was a bit of the players in those regions and kind of globally answering. Arguably the most controversial update for RO, probably the one that I was sent the most angry messages about in its entire history, would hit 8 years after launch. The Renewal update brought with it a comprehensive system-wide revamp of Ragnarok Online. That meant stats, skills, XP, level limits, monster placement, and other mechanics were all changed. Third-class jobs were also added, allowing players to break the base level limit of 99 in effect since the game's inception. Players had many issues with this update. For starters, a complete revamp of the entire game was always going to be controversial. I mean, look at NGE. And not giving your players much choice in the matter wasn't going to help either. This was Gravity effectively messing with the sauce. And that sauce was already kind of globally renowned, right? You didn't need to change the sauce. Whether this was Gravity's answers to the success of the private servers and trying to answer back at them, or them taking these drastic measures to reach more players, it's kind of unsure. But the overall result was negative, and would lead to an even bigger schism between the official and private servers. It must be noted that the update was hated so much in Japan that the Japanese audience actually rejected the update altogether, and the devs were forced to change the update to accommodate players' desires. This was the only region according to my sources that did this, which meant that every other region would be effectively forcing the update on their player base. Players again, to combat this problem, would turn to private servers for classic versions of RO or pre-renewal versions of the game. Whether it was a consequence of renewal killing much of their population, or just an overall switch in strategy, Gravity by 2010 would shrink their updates to much smaller and more frequent updates throughout the year. Many people feel that after 2010 though, the content for RO kind of falls off a cliff, which would only again strengthen the classic server argument. For frame of reference, RO was making millions in just about every major market still at this point. It was an incredibly successful title, and Gravity's most successful title, but there was always this sneaky suspicion that it just wasn't good enough for Gravity. And I mean, it's hard to be when it's a publicly traded company, who now has to answer to an investment board and basically constantly has to seek profit. You can see this direct quote from the SEC public financial filings for my evidence. We currently depend on one online game product, Ragnarok Online, for a significant portion of our revenues. None of our other online games to date has proven to be as commercially successful as Ragnarok Online, and none of our mobile games to date have been a great commercial success. With multiple failures on their belt, Gravity would take the Ragnarok IP and start spreading their wings as late as 2010, which all things considered is quite late compared to other projects. They would first find themselves on Nintendo DS as a cooperative spin-off title launched February 2010. This was another example of RO branching out in some ways, like with the anime, and doing okay, which is actually pretty good for a franchise not known for these things originally in a sense. But I'm sure that fans felt conflicted about this because it meant that Gravity was starting to focus less on Ragnarok Online. If you've been watching this video and you read the title, you've been eagerly awaiting for Ragnarok Online 2 to make its entrance. Ragnarok Online 2, like many MMO sequel projects, is super interesting to me, because not only is it quite obvious that these games weren't made by the same people entirely, RO2 wasn't made with the same spirit as RO1, and that certainly doomed the game. RO would launch in Korea March 26, 2012, and it was a total disaster for even Korea, which was RO's strongest home market. This came from a financial filing, where right ahead of the launch of RO2, Gravity was already worried about its viability. Notice how they even mentioned license agreements being terminated? That was because RO2 had the traditional publisher agreement that meant that they would be handling entire regions and not just separate countries, and they were admitting that this was making them less money. This meant that licensing made way more money for them than handling it this way. So while fans might hate the licensing thing, it seemed like Gravity loved it in terms of making money. But anyway, why didn't RO2 work? Let's look at Ragnarok Online first and get back to why it was a good game. It was a 2.5D game that had more of a focus on the playable character and its interaction with the world and its environment. While some can scoff at the idea of 2D outperforming 3D, I remember this kind of arrogance whenever I was growing up. The reason it actually can outperform it, and does often, is because the perspective that you're going to play at and force on players. For example, the sprites in RO don't really rotate past a point. Like most sprites, this is a negative in third-person games, but in a mostly 2D game with beautiful art, it's actually positive. It means that you can always see your character model quite clearly, which helps you feel connected to it. When RO2 went 3D, they made the age-old mistake, which maybe they didn't really know for the time, of simply thinking that going 3D means that you can A, maintain the same world depth, or B, maintain the artistic integrity of the game. Either a mistake or just not paying enough heed to such. RO2, I will just say, just looks generic. I'm sorry. It doesn't look like Lee's Ragnarok. And Lee apparently worked on the project, but I can't find any evidence of what he actually did, besides perhaps just put his name on it. And even if he did work on it, again, transitioning from 2D to 3D is difficult, and few games have done it well. Besides visually not feeling like Ragnarok Online, what was missing was the lore and establishment of the world that came before it. RO2 had more focus on standard questing and world story. But the problem with this approach is it doesn't familiarize your players as deeply with their environment as a sandbox-style game does. That's because essentially you're showing them the environment and then they're leaving it, never to come back again. You can have the best of both worlds and do both, right? But RO2 chose to edge more in the way of the theme park Western MMO approach with raids and more typical content. This would anger many of the fans of the core game, who loved the speed running and grindy nature of RO1. These two games were now only really related by name, with completely different ethoses. RO1 had iconic locations that players would socialize at and sell their items. RO2 would introduce automated mechanics on the other hand, like NPC stores, which instantly became botted and abandoned by players. RO2 would also bring back the card system, which was controversial because it was an RO1 in very limited fashion and players didn't like it. It would add more power into the game at a random level. For many players, this was edging further away from what Ragnarok Online was supposed to be. CD Action, a gaming outlet who reviewed RO2, had this scathing review to say after scoring at a 50 out of 100. It tries to balance between tried and true mechanics of World of Warcraft and the ideas that made the first Ragnarok popular. The outcome is mediocre, boring combat, gameplay based on uninspired quests, kill 20 of those, and small, almost linear world. RO2 offered very little in the way of redeeming for fans and critics alike, and became quite the hated title by loyal fans. Things wouldn't improve as RO2 started launching globally either. As more players got exposed to the mediocre game that barely felt like Ragnarok, players were coming to the realization as well that the sequel meant that the first game was probably going to get even less content. It didn't help that there were so many new Korean MMOs coming out at the time, like the revolutionary Arcade from Jake's Song of Lineage fame. Even Kim Ha-kyu would rear his head again and release yet another 2.5D online RPG inspired by Ragnarok Online, dubbed Tree of Savior in 2013. Tree of Savior would be marred by monetization issues, lack content, and oddly a similar fate to RO, but featured quality visuals and a quality soundtrack, showing that being RO in 2013 was still working, even in a limited fashion. A video for another time. RO2 would be such a failure that Gravity had predicted it would fail, and even fail in their own home market. Gravity would announce a shutdown in development December 23rd, 2013, a mere year after the game would launch. RO2 would last longer abroad, but failed to be anything more than a title that just kind of scraped by. Again, we see the legacy of sequel titles that stray from the formula. They aren't remembered at all. The Malaysian server would shut down sometime in 2013, ending an otherwise successful region. According to Gravity Financials in 2014, RO besides Korea across the board was down in revenue, signaling for the first time officially a dying of the brand. In private servers, however, like in Europe and Latin America, RO was still alive and well. Why Gravity didn't decide to contact these servers and instead of shutting them down and killing more of your fan base and pissing them off, actually just hiring them and getting in business with them. No, Nixie, drop, no. Whatever the reasons were, their official servers would continue to die as players demanded a classic version of the game, and it wasn't coming. Gravity had tried a few mobile games at this point, but without utilizing their most powerful Ragnarok IP, which they would rectify with a number of new titles such as Ragnarok M Eternal Love. While this game features the, again, Ragnarok name, and has some similarities, it faces the same issue as RO2 in many ways. Gravity seemed to be content on making monetization-focused Ragnarok-themed games, and that's me being nice. What games like Eternal Love would do is set a precedent that finally, unlike before, mobile games would start to make the majority of the money for Gravity going forward. Many European servers would shut down in both games, RO and RO2, May 2018. This was likely because the private servers in these regions are even more prominent, but also the general age of the game. RO was 16 years old. No matter what you do to the game will eventually phase players out. Gravity would go all in the mobile market by 2018, with a title that has ironically actually sponsored me before, Soul Arc, that would launch 2018. The Malaysian, Filipino, and Singaporean servers would shut down November 2021. This was a pretty significant shutdown, because despite being smaller countries, these countries had significant populations that played and were aware of Ragnarok Online. With no other comparable titles to go to, these fans would sort of disappear into the ether or get gobbled up by the other servers that were remaining. Gravity would keep pushing out more mobile games utilizing the Ragnarok IP as well, this time creating Ragnarok Begins. Ragnarok Begins is, again, at best a typical modern mobile MMO that utilizes the Ragnarok name. And that's about it. How Gravity can seemingly not know what the sauce is regarding the Ragnarok IP, or seem to care, is bizarre. Especially this late into developing games in that universe. But I won't mince words. These sorts of games are meant to grab excitement for a short time and make the maximum amount of money. It was sad to see the legacy of Ragnarok and Gravity, really, being utilized for something we see unknown studios more commonly involved with, or the companies that we don't like that much. Not Gravity, and the Ragnarok IP. Ragnarok Online in 2023 is actually still alive, both on official and private servers. The official servers, however, are severely marred by predatory monetization and botting still, which makes the private servers still the best way to play Ragnarok Online. You could even host your own server if you wanted to. RO1 struggles to get many updates these days, with the focus being put more on the big moneymaker for Gravity now, mobile gaming. So the fate of RO is a bit of a sad, tepid one, with Gravity seemingly content to milk it to the end. But at least we still have the private servers who have gotten an unfair rep in my opinion concerning the whole thing. My advice to future devs is if you have a Gravity situation where players are more willing to run their own servers and play on those servers, you're definitely doing something wrong. You hear that music, which means it's final deduction time. This was quite the case, detectives, but nonetheless we've gathered enough clues and evidence to put the case to bed. Gravity mishandled the IP for profit gain. Lost the initial developer core who built the game pre-launch. A failed sequel hastened both downfalls. The war of the server shoguns. The war against private servers that lost. Gravity just couldn't recapture the magic that was Ragnarok. The transition to the mobile market. Age, I mean the game is 21 years old. If you've been listening closely, you've heard the epic soundtrack featured in Ragnarok Online. A gorgeous and atmospheric set of tracks help really set and tell the story of what RO was about. It wasn't the typical MMO experience, the story was what players created on their own. Whether you spent ages grinding in dungeons or perfecting your character build to your specifications. Assuming your identity as a character in a 2.5D online anime game might kind of sound strange, but the fact that RO was able to accomplish that, with all of that said, makes it even more impressive. RO never had a fair shake. That's really what the story's about, as their company had issues before they even finished developing the game. But it's absolutely informative and crazy at the same time to see such an iconic pioneer MMO in the end run better by players than the developers. Thanks for watching, guys.
In 2291, in an attempt to control violence among deep space miners, the New Earth government legalized no-holds-barred fighting.